We are picking up in Hebrews 10, pressing on into 11 this morning. Hebrews 10, about verse 32. Right, Hebrews chapter 10, remember, he began to make application of really the arguments that he's laid out previous in the letter. About verse 19, where he starts to make this application. In 26 to 31, he really gave them very hard admonition and warning about what would happen if they're not committed to the Lord, doing His will. They violate His will. Here's what's going to end up happening. And remember, he closed out that section. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So let's read verses 32 to 39, please. Who will grab that for us?
But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul.
Okay, so another approach that he takes to admonish them in being faithful to God is remember the past. Remember where you were at one time. And what are some of the things that he talks about there in remembering the past?
Well, he describes how they were made a spectacle, how that they were reproached for their beliefs, the tribulations that came upon them, the persecutions, and the things that they were imprisoned, because he's referring to chains here, and the plundering of their goods, the losses that they had, the imprisonment, and even, as we know, those were not only in prison, but those whose lives were taken.
Yeah, he talks about there in verse 32 kind of the basis of all of that when he says, after you were illuminated. On what or about what were they illuminated? Okay, the full gospel. Now, just think about who these people are and what kind of implication that has. Okay, so who's the letter to? Hebrew Christians. What's another way to put that? Okay, what's their background and the whole struggle really that this is all about? I just want to draw this out for a second just to paint the picture.
God's chosen people, supposedly the people who knew God and had God with them.
Yes, they supposedly knew God, had God with them, John?
So they had the law of Moses that they used for hundreds and 1,000 years, and now they were enlightened with the gospel.
Okay, and that law of Moses, what had that law told them?
All the miracles that they had, all the traditions and all the miracles from past, from the beginning.
Okay.
So they should have been well, as it says, illuminated. They should have been well informed.
Okay, should have been well. They should have had some understanding. You go back into the gospel accounts, and it says that when John started his preaching, the people were wondering if he was the Christ. And the reason for that is because they knew the time was right. They had some concept, understanding, we should be seeing the Messiah. It was the hope of the Israelite nation that the Messiah would come. These people had that anticipation. That's what they grew up in. That's what they were taught. That's what their lives revolved around, was this coming of the Messiah. And then they're illuminated, the Messiah has come. How do you think they felt when they learned that?
Joy,
Joy?
great anticipation, you know. Excitement,
Joy, excitement, thrilled. The Messiah is here. So it no doubt resonated with them. They learn the gospel. They're forgiven of their sin. They have fellowship with God. They have this hope of heaven. This was a good time. He's reminding them, remember, when you were illuminated, you learned all of this, but you endured a great struggle, as Ron mentioned a while ago, in these various things that unfolded. Why would they endure a great struggle? Why was that? Why did they face being a spectacle of reproach?
Well, because they were leaving the established life and belief of the Jews and going into a life under Christ, when the Jews did not accept as the Messiah.
To me, the root cause of the problem is Satan, and we see that with Christ when he came in his efforts to destroy, the fulfillment of God's purpose and plan to bring all things together in Christ. So it's the battle that we have with Satan, who is the spirit of adversity. He's adverse to everything that God represents. And those Jews, as they were referred to, were children of Satan. They were fulfilling his purpose.
Yes, the devil's behind the scenes, influencing, manipulating, working to destroy the faith in Christians.
Well, they were looking forward to a better possession. They had freedom from sin. They had heaven to look forward to. These earthly possessions were no longer important to them because they had a much better land they were looking forward to and much better possessions that they were looking forward to.
Yeah.
That freedom from sin is what they had.
Yes, and he says here that they became this spectacle. They were illuminated, they went through struggle, they became a spectacle. And this has a reference to the idea of the victims in the arenas and the Colosseums and different things like that. When they would put them in there, they were a spectacle. And he says, you became a spectacle. You were publicly persecuted. You were reproached. There were insults brought against you. There's tribulation, so there's some type of affliction, maybe financial, maybe physical affliction. Although later he talks about, you've not yet resisted to bloodshed. Right? So they hadn't lost life yet themselves personally. There are others who had done this, others who had faced it. Stephen had been martyred, James had been beheaded, all these others that they would know about. But he says, you became these things, you endured these things. Remember, you were once committed to the point you were willing to endure this. You were willing to put up with these things. Now, the Jews who converted to Christ, as Nancy pointed out, faced tremendous pressure from other Jews. He's not talking about you had problems with the pagan Gentiles. You had problems with your fellow Jews who were believers in Jehovah. That's where the problem was. Jesus, in fact, said what would be the issue in Matthew 10. You would even face opposition where? Your own family. 5 in one house, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. Your own family. Imagine how many of these Hebrews had broken family relationships, either between parents and children, between siblings, perhaps even between spouses. One accepted Christ, the other one rejected. How difficult that would be. The Jews, what was the situation of the Jews in the first century here. Jews, if they were, let's get outside of Jerusalem. Let's say Jews in Alexandria, or Jews up in Antioch, or in Ephesus, or Corinth, or Rome. What was their condition? How did they fit into the rest of the world?
Wouldn't have a part.
They wouldn't. They had adult idols and all kinds of sexual connotations around them.
Right.
There's all kinds of things happening.
You got this sea of Gentile paganism and these little bitty islands of Jewish communities in all these different places. They were already outcast in society, and then you become a Christian. Where do you fit in? You just lost what little community and protection and connection that you had when you became a Christian, because they would cut you off. And that's what he's reminding them about. Look what you went through. You dedicated yourself. You accepted the truth. And you were committed to that. So why is he reminding them of this?
He's telling them that you've endured this, you were happy about it, you're so happy about it that you helped others with it. Don't give up. Keep going.
Okay. How are people generally, when they learn the truth, they obey the gospel? Maybe especially, I would say, if you've taught someone who's been in denominationalism, they accept the gospel, what's their attitude?
I can got my family, and they're going to listen, and they're going to do everything that's read right here, just like I did.
They are excited, they're on fire. I finally found the truth. This is great and wonderful. And yes, they're zealous to go out and tell others and share with other people. You just got to sit down and read this. And he's saying, find that zeal again. Find that fire within you again. Don't let this pressure that you came out of that and you were willing to put up with great hardships. You need to find that motivation again. He goes on to talk about, as was mentioned a while ago, you became companions of those who were persecuted, helped those who were in prison. You accepted the plundering of your goods, and that plundering there is the idea of stealing, of looting. It was acceptable in many cases that either the pagans or others could go in and just take what Christians had, because Christianity was an illicit religion in Rome. Judaism was accepted, but there came a point where they understood, well, Christianity is not Judaism, and it's okay to take their stuff. Take their home, take their property, all that kind of stuff. And they were willing to give that in the cause of Christ as well. So, all right. Question number 5 I'd ask, and we'll just touch on this briefly because we do want to jump into 11. What are some specific things that can cause us to give up and not endure? Now we know persecution, right? That's all through here. What other things can cause us to say, I'm weary, I just want to give up?
Family pressures.
Family pressures, influence of family and friends.
Discouragement
Discouragement, how?
within the church, within your family, with your spouse. Discouragement by the sin you're around in the world, in the workplace, in the schools, wherever it may be. Feeling like it's just me trying.
Yeah, sometimes there's a situation where a brother or sister in Christ, maybe that we thought was very strong and faithful, and they just head down the wrong direction and they are not penitent, and it causes you to go, wow, it's discouraging. Hank?
Health issues, you see struggles of ongoing health issues constantly.
Yeah,
That
can just
discourage the strongest person.
Why am I going through this? You know, Job faced that. You know, look at what he went through. Sometimes the guilt of sin. You know, 2 Corinthians talks about the man, you know, from 1 Corinthians who had his father's wife. It says that guilt can overwhelm him. Satan will take advantage of that and cause him to want to give up. Anita? Right. Worldliness, looking out into the world, materialism, those things. Mike?
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, kind of piggyback on what you said about the sin, but like our continual sin that we know we're struggling with, and we just keep failing at it, and failing at it, and failing at it, even though we're trying our best, and it just finally just overwhelms us to where I can't.
The devil wants to grind us down. Yeah, he'll take however he can get us, but if he can grind us down, that's it. And he's in it for the long haul, right? And we need to be in it and committed for the long haul.
And carrying on what Mike's saying, I think sometimes our own pride does make us fall. Because if I'm struggling and I'm not coming to, you know, elders or members of the church and say, hey, pray for me, you know, that's my own pride not allowing me to do that. So.
Right, exactly right. Any other thoughts, Ron?
Well, kind of an additional extension of what Anita was saying. In Colossians 2 verse 8 it says, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the traditions of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. So our faith is under attack. We see it in so many different ways. In our government, as we've been talking about with the family, all of these philosophies of men, there is no God, believe in evolution, you know, you're the greatest level of existence. It's just a bombardment against the basic principles and tenets of the truth.
Yeah, or there's this other side where people say, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus Christ, I love the Bible, but, you know, it's not a big deal.
Right.
You know, accept anybody. Everything is okay because there's grace that will just cover it all up, right? So yeah, there's all those things. But then what does he come back with when he says you know you need to have this endurance, you have an enduring and better possession in heaven. Verse 35 and following, what's his thrust there?
You know, these people were getting insulted, they were getting persecuted, but then they started going to jail. They started being having their property, their possessions taken away. They were getting tired of it. So the easy thing to do was to go back to Judaism, and all that would go away. And he's saying, don't do that. Just stick with it.
Don't do that. And we just went through all these things that could cause us to trip up, give up, turn away. And what he's saying is, you don't have to do that. You can make it. All this struggle, find that zeal that you had that put you to this disadvantage in the world where you're being insulted, you're being persecuted, that pressure's coming to bear upon you. He says, find that zeal and don't cast away your confidence. Don't turn back. There were those who were growing timid in the faith, and he's saying, be bold. Be bold in word and be bold in your action. Have patience. And after doing the will of God, he says in verse 36, you will receive the promise. There's that reward that is awaiting you. And then he quotes, of course, from the Old Testament, the just shall live by faith in Habakkuk chapter 2. So he quotes that. We're going to skip question 6 just for the sake of time. But how does he wrap it up? Verse 39.
He said we should not be drawn back into perdition or destruction, and that's the contrast that we've seen through here, is that you're either going to have the salvation of your soul or you're going to be led into destruction. God is making a distinction.
Right.
Make a choice.
And how does he frame that? Because he frames it in a particular way, Nancy.
He frames it by saying that's not who we are. There are those that are going to do that, but that's not who we are, which is just so personal. That's how we talk to our children. Yes, they do that, but that's not who we are in a family. So he makes it extremely personal, but he reassures them that's not who you are.
Exactly. I love the way that he puts it here. We are not. We're not like that. Strengthen yourself, gird yourself, press forward. Very good. All right, any other thoughts before we jump into 11? All right, let's get right into it. Let's read verses 1 through 3, please. Hebrews 11, 1 through 3. Who will grab that? Micah. Elijah.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are invisible.
Last word again.
Which are visible.
Which are visible. All right, no, it's all good. It's all good. So, definition of faith here. How does he define it? Okay, believing in things we've never seen. What does either ESV or NASB have there?
Assurance.
Okay, now faith is the
Assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
okay, assurance, conviction. The New King James and the King James has substance and evidence of things not seen. My personal faith is not evidence of anything other than that's what I believe. You know, there's people who believe in little green men, right? They believe in UFOs. I mean, they literally believe in extraterrestrial life. Now, there may be an unidentified flying object, I'll grant you that. Who knows what all's out there, flying around, different governments, whatever. There are no aliens. But there's people who believe it. There's people who are absolutely convinced the earth is flat. Totally convinced. Think the moon landing and everything else was fake. Just because they believe it is not evidence of anything other than that's what they believe. It's a conviction of things not seen. And literally this word here, the first one, substance, or what was your word again? First word. Now faith is the assurance. It literally means like a foundation that is up under something, that holds something up. Ron?
Another term for that is realization, which, also, you come to that realization. There is no denying.
Yes, exactly right. The word for evidence here, or conviction, it's really translated many times in the New Testament as to be convicted or convince or convict, things like that. So really what he's talking about here is faith is a conviction that gives rise to confidence. And he says, this is what it's about. And the elders had it, and they obtained a good testimony. And he's going to go through, of course, a whole list of various ones that exemplified faith, concrete examples in their life. And he mentions something first, though, in verse 3. By faith, we understand what?
Praying for the word of God.
What was? The worlds. What's he referring to about the worlds?
Creation.
Creation. Who is at creation to see it come into being?
The Godhead.
The Godhead. What human being was there to see it all come into? And when that breath of life went into Adam and he opened his eyes and he was conscious, everything was already there, except Eve, of course. But it was all there. He did not see anything other than Eve created. But of course, he was asleep when it was done. Even in that case, he awoke the second time and there's a woman, someone else. But those things were there, but we didn't witness it, and we cannot see God, but what? What does he say? Verse 3 again.
We see his creation, we see the evidence of God.
We see that evidence of God.
So we didn't see those things take place. But also we cannot, and nobody has ever seen what God made those things out of, because he didn't make them out of anything. He spoke them into existence. Those things that the world was made out of, they're not visible to us because they didn't exist before. That's how powerful God is. He spoke things into existence that didn't exist before. Nobody's ever seen that, and nobody ever will see that.
Right. In our mind, this is absolute fact. It's not theory. It's not a good guess or the most reasonable explanation. This is fact. God spoke all things into existence, brought something from nothing. Fact. Even though we didn't witness it, nobody witnessed it. It's a fact, though, established. We know, by faith, we know this. The evidence that is being given, the evidence we see in the world around us, the evidence as it's laid out in the Word of God, it's a fact. An undeniable fact by anybody who's honest. Any other thoughts there? Mike?
Well, I was going to say also in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he's talking about the resurrection, he says basically it's the exact same thing in the fact of the resurrection. It must be a fact. It's not just something that you feel, and it really doesn't matter if it happened or not. If it did not happen, then your faith is in vain. And the preaching that we're doing right now is completely in vain. It must have happened.
Right. Exactly right. Ron?
As we consider cause and effect relationship, and we look at this, for every effect there must be an adequate causation. There is no other explainable causation other than God.
Right. Exactly right. If you just follow the scientific reasoning in it, honestly, you'll get to that point. Right? Cause and effect. Exactly right. All right. Excuse me. So, Hebrews 11:4. Let's read that. We're just going to punch these out one at a time. Hebrews 11:4. Who's got it? Philip.
By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks.
Hey, it's very interesting that he says he being dead still speaks. Anybody see why I find that interesting?
Word. By the word of God.
Yeah, his brother's blood cried out from the ground. What do we have recorded about what Abel said to his brother, his mother, his father? Nothing. There's no recorded words of Abel at all. But yet, as Rebecca said, his blood cried out from the ground. It was speaking to God. His example speaks to us. It's screaming loud and clear of what it is to have faith. And so, somebody just give us a quick, Ron, go ahead.
So doesn't this also have a necessary inference that there is life after death?
Completely, 100%. Life after death.
It also is how we know a nation is condemned that kills innocent babies.
Yes.
Abortion. How could their blood not cry out?
Yes, blood cries out from the ground. Innocent blood cries out to God. Very quickly, what's the background of Abel here? And his brother Cain. Just somebody quickly summarize it. And by the way, everyone who is relatively mature here should know this. So I should be seeing like 10 hands go up like, oh yeah, I know this. Philip.
Abel came and offered a sacrifice of the first of his flock to God, and it was more, God accepted that, but when Cain came and offered some of his fruit and vegetables, God didn't accept that. That made Cain angry at Abel. So,
Yeah, and really that anger was toward God, but he couldn't do anything to God. He's angry because God didn't accept him. Well, I can direct that to my brother now, who did absolutely nothing against him. And so he ended up slaying him. So what are some of those lessons? I mean, there's the blood crying out from the ground. Innocent blood cries out to God. Any other lessons we see in Abel's life?
Oh, well, I was just going to say,
Or death?
in regard to Cain,
Yes, Cain.
Cain was worshiping,
Yes.
but he was worshiping unacceptably. So you can worship God, but do it unacceptably.
Yes, there's acceptable and unacceptable worship. Huge lesson there. Any other lessons?
I think also whenever you see God's reaction to that, he just talks to Cain and says, just do the right thing, that's all you have to do. And, you're conscious of the fear of this, and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's just not the route that Cain took. So we see God's mercy in that also. He could have just completely obliterated Cain right on the spot, but he chose not to.
Right.
Take the opportunity to do the right thing.
Yeah, he did. He gave him the opportunity. And when it says he did it by faith, of course we know that means he listened to what God said. He did what God said. It's just a very basic lesson. Do what God says. It's just that simple, but yet we find it so hard. It's not like it was a mystery that these two brothers were trying to figure out, well, you know what, Mom and Dad told us about this Creator, and maybe we should offer something to Him, and what are you going to offer? What are you going to offer? It wasn't that. God told them, here's what I want you to do, here's what I want you to offer. One did it, the other didn't. Then you have the results.
That principle is at the very beginning of time here for us is, if you do that which is right, you will not be rewarded for it. That's simple.
It's that simple. Yeah. But it's that hard. I mean, all of sin and come short of the glory of God. All right. Verses 5 and 6, who will read those for us? Chris.
by faith Enoch was taken away, so he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who are diligently seek him.
Okay. Let's take a quick peek at Genesis 5:24. Genesis 5:24. And who will read that for us? Philip?
Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
That's pretty much his life. He walked with God, and he was not. God took him. Of course, the Hebrew writer gives us a little bit more information. He interprets it for us, really. What did it mean that he walked with God? He pleased God. He was in fellowship with God. He respected God. He honored God. He submitted to God's will. There's a few people in the Bible that talks about that they walked with God. And Enoch is one of those that's highlighted here in the book of Hebrews. I mean, think about this, that he's got that brief mention in Genesis in this long list of genealogy, and he pulls him out and says, right there someone that we can look to as an example of faith that we should be following in their footsteps. He walked with God. Does anybody know or have a footnote about the meaning of the name Enoch? His name means dedication. He believed God existed, though God's unseen. He believed in that. And it says in verse 6, what else did he believe? Believe that God is and
Is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
verse 6 is a commentary on Enoch. And it's saying this is how we need to be. But that's 5 and 6 go together. You know, we often quote 6 out of context. We quote it, and it's fine because we make the right application. But he's really talking about Enoch because this is who he was. This was his attitude, his outlook, his view of the world. This is his faith, his conviction. Mike?
Yeah, verse 22 also says that Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah. So he had been walking with God all along, all of his entire life. It wasn't just, this one little occurrence, but this was something that was daily in his life.
Yes.
Well, also, he was Noah's great-grandfather. So look at the legacy of faith he handed down.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And John?
If you, in Jude it talks about Enoch, it tells us a little bit more about it, is that he prophesied against ungodly men, and the ungodly men that he prophesied against were those who followed after Cain. It says in Jude, it gives a description of the ungodly men that were like Cain. Well, Enoch prophesied against those and defined what their actions were. So Enoch was preaching against the ungodly at that time.
Yes, exactly. He walked with God in fellowship with God. He declared God's truth. He condemned sin in his life. And it says God took him. Why did God take him?
I feel like you just live on your city and all this stuff. I mean, the world was about to turn to the point where God was about to destroy it.
Okay. So, is another way to put that, Rebecca, a reward? Yeah. How long did Enoch's son live?
969 years.
969. How long did Enoch live? 365. About a third of his son, and really close to a third of a lot of those guys, less than half of most of those men back then. So he had a relatively short life. John, the immerser, how old was he when he died? Approximately. Okay, let's trace some things out. How old was Christ when he was crucified?
John about 30.
Okay, John was about 30 because he was 6 months older than Christ, right? So he was 30, 31, somewhere in there when he was put to death. How do we feel about when somebody young like that, now some of you may not think 30 is that young, but it is extremely young. What do we think about when someone at that age dies? We think terrible. Oh, that's so bad, They had all their life ahead of them. They were just getting going in life. Okay, 365, we may not think he was just getting going, but compared to the guys around him, he was just getting going. It's for a faithful child of God to die at any age is a blessing for that person. Why? They are at rest. They have escaped this world. Satan, temptations, trials, suffering, they have escaped it. While we may be sad, and it may be difficult for us to deal with, for them, it's good. Any other thoughts there? All right. Verse 7. Verse 7. Who will grab that for us? Hebrews 11:7.
By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith.
Okay. So, we sort of touched on it, but what's the background of Noah's story?
He was a gospel preacher.
He preached the good news. I'll agree with that. Why? What was going on? What was happening in the world?
It tells us that the imaginations of men were corrupt from their youth.
Yes. Evil thoughts continually. There was violence. Sounds a lot like our modern day. So all that's going on. There was intermarriage between the righteous and the unrighteous. You know, the sons of God and the daughters of men. That has that reference to the marriage of righteous and unrighteous. And God regretted that He had made mankind. But Noah stands out as a shining light in the midst of all that darkness, as somebody who was righteous, and he found grace in the eyes of God. And so God had declared there would be that flood of judgment. Noah and his family were to build that ark, and they're to get into that ark and be spared of that judgment. And they come out on the other side of the flood, and God makes a covenant and says, you know, I'll never do this again. So, lessons out of Noah's life. What do we get out of this?
It's important for us to know that Noah had lived 500 years, and God told him that something's going to happen in 100 or so years that you've never seen before. Well, Noah believed it and obeyed it, and that was counted to Noah's righteousness.
Okay. All right. So a couple things packed into just what John said there. He got the warning that there's this flood coming. And he took action relative to what God had told him. God warns us about an impending judgment. And just as Noah listened to God's instructions, here's how you survive this judgment. There's instructions to us how we survive the judgment. And we need to follow those instructions. The other thing is, what is interesting about Noah building an ark, being told there's going to be this worldwide flood? There's something in there in the background of the Bible, the history of the world.
It had never rained.
Hadn't rained. So if it hadn't rained, it hadn't done what?
Had no need for it.
Hadn't flooded. What are you talking about?
That's like building a boat out in California, out there in the desert from California, between California and Las Vegas. I mean, I was saying, oh, there's a flood coming.
What? Or building a ocean liner tanker like a big oil tanker right here in Newton. Who would do that? Right? And it's even more extreme because hadn't rained, hadn't flooded. John mentioned he's working how long building this big boat? 100, maybe 120 years. Because he said, my spirit will not always strive with man, 120 years. He's building it and building it and building it somewhere along in there. Whether he started halfway through, he started right away collecting wood, seasoning that wood, whatever it was. He's building it, working toward that. Even if you figure, well, maybe he waited and he built it in the last 10 years. Okay, if you started building something at that time how do you think the people around you would look at you building this big boat? And you saying, there's a worldwide flood coming. You're crazy. He had this warning for at least 100 years. And 50 years later, it hadn't rained. And 70 years later, 80 years, 90 years, 95 years later, hadn't rained. No apparent change in anything going on. But he believed completely, there's a flood coming. I'm getting this ark done. I'm going to be ready when that judgment does come. And we're going to survive this. Hank.
I often think, you have that one guy walking by and they're saying, hey, is it raining yet? You probably had hecklers, what are you doing?
Exactly. You can imagine that. And that's what it alludes to. He was a preacher of righteousness. He was not just building this, but he was out there telling people there's a judgment coming. You have to get ready for it. And how they would have mocked and ridiculed him for saying that. But who did get on the ark?
Noah, his sons, their wives, and all the creation that God chose to be on the other side of the flood, on the other side of the destruction of the earth.
Okay. So what does that teach us? And please don't tell me that we need to take care of the animals. That's not the lesson in the ark.
That God prepared a vehicle for salvation, which was the ark, and He has now, which is the church.
Yes. And relative to Noah,
He let his family go because they trusted him enough to be like, okay, we're going to help you with this. And they don't.
maybe I'm the only young person. We talked about this the other night in Wednesday night class. I didn't exactly think my parents knew the best or understood the best when I was a young person. Here their fathers received a message from God, and he says, I'm building this ark. But he led his family in faith. He led, in spite of what happens after the flood, post-flood, with Ham and all of that, and even with Noah himself, he's still a man that led his family to get on that ark and survive that judgment. And if that's all we can ever do, we have been a success in life. Our first priority is for us to be right with God. Our second priority is helping our family be right with God. And Noah did that. He was a successful man in that sense. Any other thoughts? Mike?
Just to close us off, that at that time, God chose water to separate man from sin. I think it's an allusion to what we see in baptism, when it's mentioned in 1 Peter 3, verse 20.
Yes, exactly right. It is a separator between the righteous and the unrighteous. Very good. All right, thank y'all. Lord willing, we'll pick up Hebrews 11:8 next week and press on through the chapter.